In a couple of weeks' time, I think we're all expecting that Games Workshop will use the opportunity at Adepticon to give us an initial look at the biggest release of their 3-year cycle, the next edition of Warhammer 40,000. At this early stage, I imagine it will be just a glimpse at the core protagonists, a cool animation, maybe some miniatures. We might get some teasers about rules changes as part of conversations, but it's unlikely to be anything detailed at this time. So the big question on every Warhammer 40,000 player's mind right now is this: what does 11th edition actually need to look like? For experienced players, that's because we know that every new edition of Warhammer 40,000 inevitably does two things. It fixes some of the long-standing problems that we've spent 3 years grumbling about with new features. And then the new edition will usually accidentally break something it turns out we actually really liked. We've seen it happen before, over and over again. 9th edition added incredible faction flavour, but also buried the game under layers of stratagems, supplements, and rules interactions. Then 10th edition arrived and did the opposite. It stripped the game right back to its foundations. In a lot of ways, it's worked really well, particularly for introducing new players into the game. But some things might have been stripped back a little too far. So in this video, I want to talk about my mini Grimdark's 5 things Warhammer 40,000 should change for 11th edition, and 5 things Games Workshop absolutely should not lose in the new edition. Because if they get the balance right, 11th edition could genuinely be one of the best versions of 40k we've ever had. Welcome to my mini Grimdark. Let's start with the things that probably need changing. Change 1, army building needs more depth. One of the biggest changes in Warhammer 40,000 for 10th edition from 9th edition was how army construction works. For the most part, war gear is free. Squad sizes are fixed to specific model counts. And a lot of the granular decision-making that used to exist in list building has disappeared. Now, to be fair, this helps new players in particular massively, and will have been a big reason for Games Workshop being able to balance factions and units more readily without all the extra variables that would otherwise exist. Frankly, list building is easier now than it's ever been. But, and especially for more experienced players, building an army in some of Warhammer 40,000's older editions used to feel like designing a battle plan. You had to make trade-offs. Do you take more bodies? Do you spend points on upgrades? Do you splash out on grenades and special weapons? Do you sacrifice durability for firepower? Those decisions added a strategic layer before the game even started. Speaking for myself, I love it. You could run 2 armies from the same faction that looked very similar on the surface, but could work very differently due to the nuanced war gear choices or unit sizes. You could utilize war gear and abilities choices to create a rune priest or a wolf lord with their own flavor and customization. Then you could go away and convert yourself a model worthy to have a saga written about them in the same tomes as Ragnar Blackmane and Jarl Stormcaller. It was awesome seeing the creations people pulled together, even if there have been times when this mechanic hasn't worked perfectly when overlaid with stratagems or unit buffing capability. Right now, though, some lists can feel a bit like assembling pre-packaged kits. If you take a unit, you might have a couple of choices to make, but often these choices have very little impact since they're always of equal value. For 11th edition, it would be great to see some of the depth return. I'd like to be able to upgrade my Grey Hunters with special weapons, run my Wolfguard Terminators as a heavy weapons team. Hell, I'll happily make the mistake of paying a fortune for melter bombs for my units that I'll never use, like the good old days. For casual play in particular, it was fun being able to put your own flavour on the units at your disposal, and generally speaking, it didn't break things because you had to pay a premium for those upgrades. I don't want to return to the days of flicking back and forth in a codex with a calculator to try and sum up every individual model in the unit. I don't want to return to the full complexity of older editions. But enough that list building feels like a strategy again, and war gear choices can return to being more meaningful. Even if customization was locked to specific units, I'd love to see it back in some form for 11th edition. Change number 2, Battleshock needs to matter. Battleshock was introduced as one of the headline mechanics for 10th edition. It was meant to represent units losing cohesion under pressure, but in practice, a lot of the time, it barely matters. Many players will happily ignore the possibility of Battleshock because the penalties just aren't severe enough to change their plans. Not that this is a new problem, to be honest. These sorts of tests have been challenging for a long time in Warhammer. Impactful leadership was probably only really apparent back in the earliest editions, where Space Marines would literally turn tail and flee the battlefield when they failed their leadership tests, with the possibility of being wiped out without a dice roll if the enemy units caught them. For me, morale mechanics should feel dramatic and impactful. There really should be a risk of failing and a consequence when it happens. If the risk is low, the consequence should be higher to try and promote players planning around it and making efforts to avoid it. Where right now, Battleshock often feels like a small inconvenience that disappears quickly with the expenditure of a CP where it would have mattered otherwise. And armies that lean heavily on it, like Chaos Knights for example, feel a little disadvantaged for trying to utilize the mechanic versus just having army-wide buffs for their units. For 11th edition, it would be great to see Battleshock become something players actually have to plan around. I wonder if Battleshock should be something that can be mitigated when leader characters are close by, but otherwise something units are much more likely to fail in general when units find themselves in isolation. This would promote careful planning during the movement phase, and even increase the viability of traits like precision, where the consequence of losing your leader character could be more dire than just losing their datasheet. Your front line could essentially crumble if you lose that important leadership figure. Change number 3, the game is extremely lethal. Modern 40k is very lethal. Units of Space Marines can disappear incredibly quickly, and for new players in particular, this genuinely is a problem. How do you enjoy learning the game if a simple mistake like forgetting to hug cover or stay an inch back from the wall could result in your unit being wiped out in a quick flurry of dice? Sometimes that carefully painted squad that you've paid all that money for and spent all that time on is removed from the board before it's even had a chance to do anything. This can lead to games that feel decided very early in 10th edition. A player recently essentially told me that the game was over when I got first turn with my fast-moving melee force against their gunline army. They weren't entirely wrong on that occasion either. If lethality came down just a little bit, it would allow for more room for movement, positioning, and tactical play. Games Workshop would have to carefully consider how to stop battles just becoming a mosh pit in the middle of the table, but perhaps increasing the overall value of cover and reducing the availability of dice rerolls for the attacking player across the board would help with this as a starting point. Right now, games of 10th edition sometimes feel like an alpha strike contest. A slightly slower battlefield would give more units the chance to actually participate in the game. Change number 4, terrain still causes confusion. Terrain's been one of the most consistently confusing parts of Warhammer 40,000 in the modern era across latest editions. Before many games even start, players are going to have to clarify things like, how are we treating these runes? Do these count as obscuring? How does line of sight work through this terrain piece? That kind of ambiguity can slow games down and potentially even cause unnecessary friction where players misunderstand the ambiguity. And this isn't the fun part of the game, really. There isn't any joy in having to remind yourself of the rules of hills and forests versus ruins, for example. A cleaner terrain system would make games smoother and reduce the need for pre-game negotiations. One where terrain acted consistently, regardless of whether it happened to be a rune or a forest, for example, could make a big difference in speeding the game up and smoothing out aches and pains for players learning the game. Additionally, I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I went to a tournament or a local gaming store for a match and saw a tree, or a chapel, or a burnt-out tank, maybe some rubble. Has anybody actually seen a hill in 40k in like 3 editions? It appears that in the far future there is only wall and very flat battlefield with L-shaped ruins. Making terrain simpler would remove the necessity for tournaments to simplify the terrain we play on. And we can start playing on tabletops that look awesome and flavoursome again. If forests and ruins behaved the same way, it wouldn't matter how you dressed your table, and we can all go back to Catachan for a good scrap again. Change 5. Faction flavour needs expanding. One of the trade-offs of 10th edition's streamlined rules is that some armies lost a bit of their unique identity. Sub-factions largely disappeared, and many armies now rely heavily on a single detachment identity. While I genuinely think that detachments are a great system, players often want more ways to express the different themes within their army. For example, for my Space Wolves, I want different rules for a fast-hunting force versus a heavy infantry great company or a saga-driven heroic army. At the moment, with an army rule tied to Oath of Moment and fairly bland chapter-specific detachments outside of Beastslayer, Space Wolves, like many other factions rules-wise, feel a bit neutered by 10th edition. Bringing more variety back into faction design would help restore some of that unique flavour that makes Warhammer so fun. World Eaters play very, very differently to Emperor's Children, with Death Guard being very different again. Maybe the only solution here will be to give Dark Angels, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, and Black Templars similar treatment and their own independent codex books. They wouldn't have to lose access to the units in Codex Space Marines, though I imagine some would go the wayside, but it would create the opportunity to give these divergent chapters their own, fully fleshed out identities within the rules to match their lore. Similarly, Eldari Craft Worlds and Votan Leaks could have overarching army rules that then divided into detachments, rather than one army rule for all. I also think there's something more to be done with keywords to help with this. Back in the not-so-far past, a Chaos Marines player could spend 10 points and give their unit the Mark of Khorne for increased melee capability. Going forward, wouldn't it be awesome if we could do something similar with keywords? Give your standard Astartes units a Space Wolf keyword for an extra pip of movement and advance and charge, or something similar for some points expenditure. Or spend X number of points on an Imperial Fists keyword for the heavy trait and extra leadership. Upgrading units in this fashion to make them faction-specific would then allow for interactions between them and the detachment stratagems for these factions too. Certain units could be restricted, of course, chaplains and apothecaries not being able to take the Space Wolves keyword, for example. But it would be a great way to bring faction flavour into an army, in my opinion, if done correctly. I could keep going, but all being said, 10th edition did a lot of things right as well. So here's the things that 11th edition really shouldn't lose, in my opinion. The first of those, and the most important, I think, the simplified core rules. One of the biggest successes of 10th edition was simplifying the core rules. Compared to the complexity that built up towards the end of 9th edition, the game became much easier to learn. That accessibility is incredibly important. It helps new players into the hobby, and it makes teaching the game far less intimidating. Even from the perspective of somebody arguably longer in the tooth, having played 40k since the 90s, I've enjoyed the fact that I've spent far less time checking one of half a dozen rulebooks that I previously had to carry around in certain editions, and instead get to spend time rolling dice and playing the game. That's a huge and appreciated change, and it needs to be maintained in 11th. 11th edition should absolutely build on this foundation, rather than being tempted to reverse it. Heap number 2 is the modern datasheets. The current datasheet format is one of the best quality of life improvements the game's ever had, in my opinion. Everything you need for a unit is right there on the sheet: weapons, abilities, special rules. Older editions often required flipping between multiple pages in a codex just to understand how a unit worked. Now it's all contained in one place, and the game flows much more smoothly because of it. Although I'd like to see some options for upgrading and personalization of unit, I don't want it to be at the expense of this improvement. And in fact, I'd hope Games Workshop rules designers have set themselves a simple standard. If they can't fit the rules onto the datasheet format, the rules for the unit are too much and need to be rethought. Heap number 3, the living rules model. One of the most important changes in modern 40k is how Games Workshop supports the game after release, and we've seen improvements in 10th edition again. It's far from perfect, and there's been some features here and there that need ironing out. The fact that the rules in many codex books were outdated before they even got onto the shelves in the shop throughout 10th edition is a genuine problem when you consider how much money people are paying for these books. That said, through balanced data slates, FAQs, and points updates, the game is now consistently evolving and, essentially, improving in real time. Instead of waiting years for problems to be fixed, as was once the case, adjustments can happen regularly. And with these rules being more readily available online and to download, updated in the app, this again enhances accessibility for everybody. That kind of ongoing support is incredibly healthy for the game, supporting both faction and unit balancing, but also player accessibility to vague rules that could be interpreted the wrong way, or mistakes that could under or overpower a unit or stratagem, for example. A note on this though, Games Workshop just needs to be careful in ensuring that they focus on the things players want fixing, rather than playing around with how vehicles move over and over again, just for example. Heap number 4, faster game flow. 10th edition reduced the amount of rule stacking that slowed games down in previous editions, less stratagem spam, and fewer overlapping buffs. The result is a game that generally plays much faster. That's extremely important for both casual games and tournaments. Now in 11th edition, I'd like to see Games Workshop expand on this and really build by reducing dice rerolls as well. We've made progress here, but too many stratagems and abilities still rely on re-rolling dice for impact, and that makes for unnecessary convoluted dice transactions between players. Honestly, I think if Games Workshop halved the number of mechanics that ultimately led to dice rerolls for attacking players across all factions, we'd reduce lethality and improve on game speed in one go, which obviously makes it sound much easier than it actually is, of course. Finally, something that Games Workshop deserves a bit of credit for. Overall, faction balance in 10th edition's been pretty solid from start to finish. There've definitely been bumps in the road, and if you're around from it, you'll always remember Eldari Gate at the very start of the edition. I will probably never forgive Games Workshop for the experience of facing 3 almost identical Eldari armies in my first 5 games of the edition in my first tournament of the edition. Imperial Agents as well were a marked mistake by Games Workshop. If their intention from the get-go was not to support this new faction, with balance passes, this should have been communicated more transparently and more honestly from day one. There's nothing wrong with making a faction that's purely flavoursome for casual gaming. Many players, including myself, would buy in happily if the faction appealed. Releasing a new codex and then quietly ignoring it will lose Games Workshop trust and leave players, especially newer players, feeling cheated though. This shouldn't happen in my mind. That said, regular updates have kept most factions within a relatively healthy performance range. And that level of balance isn't easy to achieve in a game with so many factions and units, especially when you consider the complex number of variables that impact the power of these factions and units like stratagems and detachment buffs. Many other gaming systems fail to achieve this with far fewer factions and units, so Games Workshop are, generally, doing well here, and I'd like to see them continue to build on this in 11th edition. Personally, I also don't mind certain factions being weaker than others. Any long-term Orc or Imperial Guard player will attest that this is their experience of the game in general, and these factions have some of the most loyal and dedicated communities of Warhammer 40,000. Also, I don't think casual gaming is ever really balanced, since players will regularly play units they want to play, rather than the ones that are most optimal. Rule of Cool is the name of the game for most players in this setting, but maintaining the standard the Games Workshop have set themselves in 10th edition for general faction balance should absolutely remain a priority for 11th edition going forward. Players need to be in a position where, with a little bit of list optimization in mind, no matter what faction they're taking to the tabletop, they should always feel like they have at least a chance to win the game. So if you step back and look at all of this, the direction for 11th edition in my mind is pretty clear. Keep the accessibility that 10th edition introduced. I want to build and paint up my plastic addiction and then meet people to roll dice and play the game. I don't want to spend half of my time double checking rulebooks. But bring back some of the depth and flavour that gave players faction character to work with and made earlier editions so engaging. In other words, keep the clean engine, but put back some personality into the machine. If Games Workshop can strike this balance, 11th edition could genuinely be one of the best editions yet. But I'm just one man. I'm really curious what you all think. What's the one thing you'd like to see changed in 11th edition? And what's the one thing Games Workshop, for you, should absolutely not mess with from 10th edition? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Keep hobbying.